Coming up, an Osage expert discusses sovereignty and changing tribal constitutions. Plus, a new anthology shares stories, essays, and poems. And Holly Cook Macarro breaks down what Indigenous Peoples Day means. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We begin in Washington, D.C., where the Interior Department has released a progress report sharing how it is tackling climate change. Last week, the agency's 10-page report said it has made several investments. That includes committing $46 million in appropriations to tribal communities who are already feeling the impacts. The Interior Department also said it has hosted virtual listening sessions with tribal leaders about the topic. Outside of Indian Country, the agency said it has developed a new offshore wind strategy for leasing, which hopes to provide more transparency for stakeholders. Secretary Deb Haaland said the climate adaptation plan has bold goals. She said she will address them using science-based approaches. Well, a powwow parade and memorial walk were just a few of the events for Native American Day in Rapid City, South Dakota over the weekend. The arena for the Black Hills Powwow was completely full with over 1,500 dancers. This year's parade grand marshal was Jackie, the widow of the late Tim Gallego.
Honored, very honored. It's a blessing. I can't believe the community has come together like this. It's awesome. Thank you.
In 1989, Tim worked with Governor George Mickelson to create Native American Day. Tim also founded the Lakota Times 41 years ago, which is now ICT's company, Indig Public Media. The annual Remembering the Children Memorial Walk honored 50 children who died while attending the Rapid City Indian Boarding School. Participants carried cards with the names of the children who passed.
The Memorial Walk is important to our project because as soon as it was confirmed that, according to our oral histories and the independent research, that there was graves, remnants of graves up on top of that hill, we made a promise to the children that day that we would never forget them.
Blessing for the memorial and construction will begin this fall. In Canada, a Métis mother says a worker at her child's daycare cut her son's hair without permission. As a result, Jana Nyland pulled her son out of the daycare center. Here's APTN's national news team with the latest.
She says she contacted police to file a hate crime complaint. The Saskatoon Police Service confirmed they received the complaint and are investigating. The Ministry of Education told APTN News they also received a complaint and are investigating. The child care provider posted this on Facebook after the mother complained. "I did accept I cut child's hair without his mom permission, as I don't know this is his first haircut." Key point, first haircut is very important for everyone. Please cut your child's hair immediately after birth and put in safe closet for whole life until she died. Important point, it will save you from evil eyes, ghosts, witches, enemies, and any other invisible creatures. So I am going to main point, that's why this all story happened. Canadian, Indian, or different ethnic residential school system. I think behind the story of haircut is Indigenous. Indigenous means extra brilliant mind peoples. People history, they was considering long hair as a symbol of their culture, their belief, and their religion. APTN contacted the daycare worker for a comment, but she said she wasn't ready to speak to media yet. Janet Island says she was horrified when she realized her son's hair had been cut.
One afternoon, just randomly, I came to pick him up and I noticed that his hair was cut. I confronted her for a reason why she cut my child's hair, and her reasoning was, I don't like long hair on boys and Native children should not have long hair.
Daycare is now being investigated by the Saskatoon Police, and its license is under review. Several tribal nations in the U.S. are getting funding for internet access. The grants are coming from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration and will provide thousands of people with high-speed broadband. In Alaska, the Kuskokwim region is one of the most underserved groups when it comes to internet connectivity. The grant will now help the Alaska Fiber Optic Project to implement a fiber optic cable for the first time. It is slated to help over 7 rural communities along the Kuskokwim River. The Winnebago tribe in Nebraska is also benefiting from the funding. The tribe was granted over $35 million to increase connectivity to over 600 homes. Officials say the grants are part of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Jim Gray was the youngest chief to be elected to lead the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. During that time, he worked through many issues that helped strengthen his government and ultimately the Osage people. Today, he's a consultant with Gray Consulting. He helps other tribes with a number of issues, such as updating their tribal constitutions and expanding their business developments. He joins us now to talk about tribal sovereignty, which is an important topic all the time, but especially in an election year. Welcome, Jim.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
With the midterm election less than 1 month away, what are you most concerned about when it comes to tribal sovereignty?
Well, I think the most important thing is the more universal truths that govern Indian country, and that is the sovereignty to be able to pursue goals and aspirations that are consistent within your tribe's culture, and have the freedom to be able to pursue those in areas of historic preservation, economic development, and a variety of other things. And it just helps bring our people together.
You speak on updating and changing tribal constitutions to better serve tribal citizens. What are some of the key changes you see that tribes need to make in those constitutions?
I think what we're looking at right now in 2022 is that many tribes are governed under a document that was created nearly 100 years ago. The Indian Reorganization Act created kind of a model constitution that had very limited authority and very limited checks and balances. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to evolve out of those without the assistance of the Department of Interior, who serves as the trustee over many of these tribes' activities and how they govern themselves. And so that's probably one of the biggest challenges, being able to modernize our tribe within that structure.
Are people at all surprised to know that the Interior Department plays a role like this in updating tribal constitutions?
Well, I know that it's not quite the most openly discussed topic in Indian country, but it is a foundational document that basically governs how a tribe makes decisions, how they see themselves and how they interact, and what are the checks and balances in the system. And when we're governed by our activities, a lot of what happens is that we are governed by the documents that we are operating under. And if they're not serving the needs of our people, then it creates legitimate internal challenges that makes it difficult for us to fully express ourselves in our sovereignty.
When I think about changing tribal constitutions, I immediately think about all the interviews I've had with Native leaders over the past few years. And one of those topics that always seems to be something that people either want to talk about or want to avoid is blood quantum and tribal citizenship. Is that something that you've had to deal with in working with tribes who are updating their constitutions?
I think one of the biggest challenges that tribes face is trying to detach themselves from the colonial influences that were there when these constitutions were drafted. There's very little in the historical record that shows where tribes actually identified themselves as under a blood quantum. This is a European tool. And unfortunately, it is a part of many tribes' governmental identities and how they identify their own members. And some tribes have evolved out of it, and some are still stuck in this internal grip that these colonial institutions have on our tribes' ability to identify each other.
I want to switch gears and talk about economic development because that, of course, is another part of the work that you do. So maybe tell us, what kinds of projects you're working on in that regard.
In economic development, I think your earlier presentation discussed a lot of that, is the historic amount of investment that the federal government's making in Indian country to help build reliable broadband and infrastructure with the infrastructure law that went into place this year. And tribes are actively trying to find ways to bridge the digital divide, as they called it back in the 90s. And the fact that the resources are finally available to us is a big game changer. It's going to provide economic opportunities for our tribal members. It's going to improve education, telemedicine. It's going to improve the lives of people who live on the reservations in the most rural areas of the country.
I want to talk about another form of economic development that we're seeing, and that, of course, is the film industry. And I understand the Osage, you recently had a film, a high budget with some pretty cool celebrities and actors there. Maybe talk about, how that's impacting your tribal nation.
Okay, the movie is called Killers of the Flower Moon, and it is documenting a very dark chapter in our tribe's history. And you're right, it is getting a lot of a major investment from Hollywood to make a big budget movie production out of it. The director is Martin Scorsese, and the lead actors are Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro, and a featuring Lily Gladstone, who is playing a very prominent role in this movie. So we're all very excited about what this movie could be for us, but unfortunately, it is a dark story. There's a lot of violence in it, and we hope that maybe in telling this story, it could help open up a dark chapter that most of America has not been familiar with. The rampant killing that took place on our reservation because of our oil wealth, and how we survived. And that's the important thing is that it didn't define us at that dark period, but it does give us a sense of purpose on how we conduct ourselves today.
Well, Jim Gray, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
The perspective of Choctaw matriarchs is being presented in a new anthology called Stories by Choctaw Women. 10 women contributed stories that range from fiction and nonfiction, some essays, family letters, and even poetry. Joining us today are the two women who edited the book, Leslie Stahl-Widener and her sister, Celia Stahl-Meadows. Thank you both for joining us. Leslie, let's just jump right in here. The two of you contributed 2 stories each. So give us an idea of what your poem, Three Sisters, is about.
Three Sisters is about the traditional food of the Native American: corn, squash, and beans. And I wanted to make it kind of fun and something relatable to children so that they could, if they haven't heard about it, they might ask questions.
And Celia, the first chapter in the book is your story, Influenza, and I understand it compares the influenza pandemic in 1919 to the coronavirus pandemic. Maybe talk about that.
Sure. Thank you. And Halito, I'm glad to be here. I kind of started that story during the pandemic. I was reading some posts online, and one of my people I had on Facebook, her mother was undergoing really some troublesome times with being in the hospital and being on a ventilator and all the things that you read about. And so I had always wanted to write a story about our great-grandmother, and she also died during the 1919 Spanish flu, as did her daughter. So anyway, I thought, well, it'd be neat to kind of do a letter comparison. So one's a diary and one's basically a social media post, and tried to parallel the two and pull them together at the end. So it was a fun story to write.
I can imagine. I mean, and to compare a letter, as you mentioned, to a social media post just goes to show how far technology has evolved. Leslie, I want to go back to you. Tell us what some of the other topics are in this anthology.
Well, there's a woman that she rewrote her aunt's letters she lived in the southeastern part of Oklahoma, and it was her great aunt, and that was fun. And then there was some fiction. There was the story I wrote on was the memoir piece about going for a research project for the textile program, and the following piece was a woman, Jennifer Byram, who works for the Cultural Center as a historic preservationist in textiles, and she wrote one on dyeing, which was really fun because we experimented with dyeing on the weekend. It was really fun. There were just a lot of stories of different fiction, some nonfiction. There's a piece about Wheelock, which is a residential school in Oklahoma, southeastern Oklahoma, and yeah, it was a fun group of women and a fun range of topics.
Celia, I want to go back to you because this anthology actually includes a glossary of Choctaw words. Why was that important to you to include in it?
Yes, a glossary, because most people aren't familiar with Choctaw words, we felt like we didn't want to necessarily define them within each chapter, although sometimes in context you can tell what they mean. But we wanted readers to gain a better understanding of the Choctaw language, and so we waited until the glossary to present all the definitions. So we hope that they'll flip back between the story and the glossary and the story and the glossary, and just gain a little bit more understanding of our heritage and our culture. And that's the whole book was based on faith, family, and culture theme. So anyway, that's part of our reasoning.
Leslie, I want to ask you about how it felt for you to be able to take on a project like this with your sister. Was this something that you all had worked on before?
Well, we kind of started it in 2020 and talked about it a lot, and then contacted several women most of the women we all knew personally. And we knew they had good stories to tell because we had talked with them before. But it was really fun, and it was all the funny part was it's my sister and I worked on it, but there were mother-daughters, sisters, cousins. It was a fun group. We were all interconnected in some way, and we're all Choctaw, and that was what was really fun. It was kind of a family effort.
I love that. Celia, we only have about 30 seconds left here, but maybe tell our viewers where they can find this anthology online or in a bookstore.
Yes, we actually have the anthologies at the Choctaw Cultural Center gift store. So they're there. It's also online through the Choctaw store. They can go there and find a link to order it that way. And anyway, we hope they enjoy them. It's a piece of history. It's a piece of our culture, and we think it's important, and certainly we thank the leadership at the tribe for giving us this opportunity. And thank you.
Well,
Yakoki.
Yakoki.
Many states have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. It is a movement that is decades in the making. Here to weigh in on the politics of this name is ICT regular contributor Holly Cook Macarro. She's a partner with Spirit Rock Consulting, and she's from the Red Lake Ojibwe Nation. Welcome back, Holly.
Hi, Leah. It's good to see you.
So President Biden declared Monday, October 10th, as Indigenous Peoples Day, and then in a separate proclamation also declared it Columbus Day. Maybe talk about what that means and if that's something that happens often to, name a day as separate holidays.
Well, I don't think it happens very often, and it is reflecting a time period where we are seeing a lot of change. And this Indigenous Peoples Day 2022, I'm sure that you probably noticed as well, there was an extraordinary amount of recognition, right? We fought the fight to have the name changed. It started with some major cities. I think the conversation actually started back in the early 70s. And when folks began pushing for recognition that Christopher Columbus was not the hero that he was made out to be. But think of that was 40 years ago. And it's taken all of this time for us to get to a place where we have this recognition on a national scale, with so many allies, with the corporate world, with the president declaring it, the kind of the dual recognition, as you note. And I think that may be a nod to the Italian American community as well, in terms of that recognition. But the reality of the history of Christopher Columbus, I think, has been largely debunked, or what has been taught, and the reality has been put forth. So this is a new time, and really a time of change. I actually don't see the declaration for Christopher Columbus Day. I don't see it standing. I think it will become Indigenous Peoples Day universally.
I was at an Indigenous Peoples Day festival on Monday, and somebody actually asked me, what would it take for Indigenous Peoples Day to become a federal holiday? And I said, that's a great question. Let me ask Holly Cook Macarro.
Yes, that would take an act of Congress. And so that may be something we can begin to advocate for, that sort of recognition, right? We have in November, which is Native American Heritage Month. And excuse me, and I see some value in some of these thinking. It sometimes feels as if we are in October with the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, and then several other state or regional recognitions. California Indian Day, for example, was 2 weeks ago, and then we move into November. So it would make sense for there to be a recognition of the indigenous people, the first people of what is now the United States. I really love that piece put out there. I think it was by Stephen Paul Judd that says, "I loved America before it was America," and that is really, I think, the story of Indian country. These are our homelands as well.
You actually gave a speech on Monday on Indigenous Peoples Day. What did you highlight in that speech in terms of, what was important to celebrate on Indigenous Peoples Day?
I spoke at the Global Gaming Expo in Las Vegas, where I am today, and it's a gathering of gaming professionals, and not just from the Indian gaming industry, but broadly, and with a large tribal track and contingent here as well from Indian country. And I joined a panel with Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell and Chairman Reed Milanovich from the Agua Caliente out in Palm Springs. And I talked about where we are today, and that how far we've come, and a little bit about what I mentioned earlier, just the broad recognition, and some of what we've seen reflected in politics with the election of the nomination of Deb Haaland, the appointment of Lynn Malerba as treasurer. All of these things that have happened in the last couple of years, it's really just been a watershed couple of years for Indian country. All these firsts just seem to be falling, just one right after another. But all of that, we can still wake up on November 9th, and we could have half of our delegation in the Native American caucus gone. The races are that close, and that we are 4 weeks away from that. And so I think while we can celebrate and how broadly the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day is today, but we also could wake up on November 9th and say, what just happened here? And so it's really, I think, a sign of how far we've come and how much work we have left to do.
And you're actually continuing that work later this week. I saw that you're speaking on a Native voting panel. Actually, you're moderating. Yes. We only have a short time left here, but tell our viewers about that.
Yes, the Native Voters Alliance and the Illuminative are joining together to host a Native Vote Town Hall. So we have a number of speakers coming in to talk about what they're doing in their states and their regions, on their reservations, and why it's so important to get to the polls this year. We hear it every year. This is the year, it's about the Supreme Court. Well, there are some very, very real things that we have in front of us in Indian country and that are driven by the folks that we elect. And the Native vote has huge power this year. We can win a seat in Alaska. We can drive races that are going to have very thin margins within the margin of what our Native populations are in Arizona, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin. So all eyes are on Native vote this year. We're going to be talking about that tomorrow.
Well, Holly, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Aaliyah.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand, just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.